Greetings, this is a reading of the book The Airship Golden Hind. Some of the language in this book has not aged well and is indeed no longer politically correct. Take caution when listening to this visual audiobook. Footage and photography are provided by Photations. At Photation, we believe that the world would be a better place if people spent their time being creative. Join us in practicing art so we all can be the master of art. Fine art prints available at our store www.photationsstore.com. Keep our artwork alive by making a donation at photationsdonations.com. The Airship Golden Hind by Percy F. Westerman. Chapter 16, The Observation Basket. While the Golden Hind was struggling towards the shores of Western Australia, Count Carl von Sensei in 64 was flying almost due south from Samray in the island of Java. He too had had a taste of the cyclone, which had extended over the whole of the Arabian Sea and had been severely felt as far north as the Persian Turkestan frontier. Practically helpless in the grip of the furious blast, 64 had been driven far off her course. Passing high over the mountainous districts of Tibet, the German airship, unseen and unheard, finally encountered a stiff northerly wind when approaching the China Sea. In the neighborhood of Hanoi already, the start von Sensig had obtained over his British rival was wiped out. The long detour he had been obliged to take represented 12 hours flight under normal conditions, and since he knew of Fosterdake's progress by the expedient of picking up the Golden Hind's wireless message, he realized that the latter had made good her belated departure. At Samrain, 64 took in fresh hydrogen and petrol. Von Sensig reported his arrival to the representatives of the International Air Board and stated his intention of proceeding via New Guinea, New Caledonia, and Norfolk Island to New Zealand, where he would be able to fulfill one of the conditions that required the competitors to touch at a spot within 1 degree of the nadir to their starting point. But von Sensig had no intention of carrying out his declared program. Directly he was well clear of Samray, he shaped a course due south in order to pick up the prevailing westerly wind south of Australia, on which Fosterdike counted. Also, a stiff northerly wind over the Sunda Sea helped the German to attain his object, and on the evening that the Golden Hind drifted to south of Fremantle, 64 was skirting the coast of West Australia in the neighborhood of Jobre Bay. Von Sensig was in a bad state of mind. He knew by means of a code message from Barcelona that one of his agents had made an attempt to delay the Golden Hind's departure. What had actually taken place he knew not. All he did know was the galling fact that the attempt had been unsuccessful, and that by this time his rival was practically level with him. Hans, he exclaimed, calling one of his subordinates, formerly an underlieutenant in the German flying service, and before that a mercantile marine officer. Hans Luder clicked his heels and stood to attention. You know Fremantle, inquired the Count brusquely. Fairly well, Mynheer, was the reply. I've called there perhaps a dozen times in cargo boats. The last time was in January 1914. There was, of course, no aerodrome there then. Assuredly no, sir. According to my information, it is on the right bank of the Swan River and a couple of kilometers to the east of the town. It ought to be easily found. Hans Luder agreed that to locate it ought to be a simple matter. Then we'll do so, little Hans, exclaimed the Count grimly. We might even make the Englishman Fosterdike a little present anonymously, of course. The ex-under-lieutenant grinned. You wish me to take the Albatross for an airing then? He said. No, replied von Zindig. If our Albatross were invisible and noiseless, it would be different. We'll use the observation basket, overhaul the mechanism carefully, because you, little Hans, are going to use it. Hans Luder saluted and went for cert. He was not at all keen on being told off for observation work, but his innate sense of discipline made him accept the duty without outward signs of resentment. Somehow he didn't relish the idea of being lowered from the Zeppelin and allowed to dangle at the end of 2,000 or 3,000 feet of fine wire. Shortly before midnight, the lookout on 64 picked up the harbor and town lights of Fremantle. It was now a fairly calm night. At 5,000 feet was a stratum of light clouds, sufficient to obscure the starlight. The climatic conditions for von Sinzig's plans were exactly what he wanted. When the German airship was dead to windward of the town, her motors were switched off, and she was allowed to drift in and out of the lower edge of the bank of clouds. From her foremost nestled a circular basket, fitted with a vertical vane to prevent it from turning round and round like a gigantic meat jack, was hanging in the basket, with a couple of small incendiary bombs for company, was Hans Luder. In order to keep in touch with the captain of his 64, Hans was provided with a wireless telephone. All ready, announced the observer lower away. The well-oiled mechanism ran smoothly and noiselessly until a sudden check in the downward journey told Hans that the observation basket had reached the limit of its cable, from where he dangled nearly 2/3 of a mile below the airship. The 64 was quite invisible. It was therefore safe to assume that the good people of Fremantle were likewise not in a position to see the huge gas bag 5,000 feet overhead, while the insignificant observation basket, although only 1,000 feet or so up, was too minute to be spotted against the blurred starlight. On the other hand, Hans Luder could command a fairly comprehensive view of the town beneath them. The tranquil waters of the Swan River enabled him to fix his position, for even on the darkest night a river can readily be seen by an aerial observer. The navigation lamps of the aerodrome almost misled him. At first he mistook them for the railway station, but when he discovered his mistake he asked himself why the aerial signaling lamps were still being exhibited. According to the latest wireless messages picked up by 64, the Golden Hind ought by this time to be berthed in the hangar, but perhaps, he argued, the officials, in their demonstrations of welcome, had forgotten to switch the lights off. This reminds me of London. In 1916, thought Hans. London, in those good old days when our Zeppelins came and went almost without let or hindrance. Now, my beauty, you and I must part. He raised the bomb and poised it on the edge of the basket. In his excitement, he had completely forgotten his fears at being suspended by a steel rope almost the same gauge as a piano wire. The incendiary bomb was quite a small affair, but none the less efficacious. In order to guard against identification should any of the metal parts be found, the vanes were stamped with the British government marks, which showed that von Sinzig, with characteristic Teutonic thoroughness, had taken the precaution of covering his tracks. The British Air Ministry and the Australian Commonwealth government could appraise responsibility later. By that time, 64 would be thousands of miles away, allowing for the slight breeze. Hans Luder telephoned for the Zeppelin to steer 10 degrees to the northward slowly. 64 carried out the instructions, and seesaw gently. The observation basket moved in a slightly different direction from its previous line of drift until the crucial moment arrived. Hans Luder released the bomb. For 3 seconds, the observer could follow its downward passage, then it vanished into the darkness. 5 seconds later, the missile hit its objective. There was no need for a second bomb. The airship shed was blazing fiercely. The Hun in the basket spoke into the telephone. Direct hit, he reported. Haul me up. 64 had once more stopped her motors and was rising rapidly above the bank of clouds. At the same time, a motor winch was winding in the cable, and Hans Luder's rate of progress as the basket wired to the air brought back all his fears concerning his hazardous position. But if there were a flaw in the wire, it was ex-government stuff. He recalled material that might have been left lying in a neglected condition 4 months before von Sinzig acquired it for its present purpose. And supposing the wire slipped off the drum and got nipped in the cogs of the winch, a score of thoughts of a similar nature flashed across the observer's mind. He broke into a gentle perspiration. He trembled violently as a mental vision of himself hurtling through space gripped him in all its hideousness. But the wire held. Hans Luder was assisted into the nacelle, where he promptly fainted. By that time, 64 was several miles away from Fremantle, but a dull red glare on the horizon unmistakably indicated the extent of the conflagration. Throughout the night, 64 flew at an altitude of not less than 15,000 feet. Dawn found her far to the southward of the great Australian Bight. Von Sinzig had good cause for keeping out of the beaten steamer tracks, nor did he intend to pass within 100 miles of the southern part of Tasmania. He counted upon arriving at Napier, New Zealand, at daybreak on the day following, and until then he meant to be most careful not to be reported by any vessel. The commander of 64 had just sat down to breakfast when one of the crew entered his cabin. "Pardon, Herr Offizier," said the man apologetically, "but the observation basket is missing." "What do you mean?" demanded von Sinzig. "We secured it after Herr Luder had finished with it, Herr Captain," explained the man. I myself saw that the 4 bottle screws were turned up tightly. Caspar Grizz, who had been told to remove the remaining petrol bomb, came and reported that the basket was no longer there. The metal clips were still attached to the bottle screws. It would appear that these were torn from the basket itself. Count Karl von Sinzig left his breakfast untasted and hurried along the catwalk to the gondola from which the observation basket was hung. His informant's news was only too true. Unaccountably, the basket had been wrenched from its securing apparatus. "It is of little consequence," he declared. "We would not have required it again, and since it will not float, it is at the bottom of the sea by this time. Perhaps it is as well in case we are inspected by inquisitive officials at our next alighting place." It was an unlucky day for 64. About noon, 2 of her motors developed trouble simultaneously. 3 hours elapsed before the sweating mechanics were able to get the recalcitrant engines in running order again, and during that period the Zeppelin had perforce to slow down considerably. Consequently, it was half an hour after sunrise, when the 64 sighted the Three Kings Island to the northwest of Cape Maria Van Diemen. Here she altered course, so as ostensibly to appear as if she had been flying straight from New Caledonia, and skirting the west coast of New Zealand, headed for Napier, where, by the consent of the New Zealand government, Watson was permitted to land and thus carry out one of the conditions of the contest. We'll fly inland when we sight Auckland, decided the Count. No, don't take her up any higher. There is now no need for concealment. Let these New Zealanders see and comment upon the fact that their islands are not beyond reach of a good German airship. And so, flaunting her prowess in the rapidly growing daylight, 64 approached the town of Auckland. The Zeppelin was within 10 miles of the place when one of the crew shouted the disconcerting information that there was an airship on the starboard bow traveling east by north. Rapping out a furious oath, von Sinzig snatched up a pair of binoculars. He had never before set eyes on the Golden Hind, although the British airship had passed almost immediately above him within a few minutes of 64 leaving her Spanish base, but instinctively he realized that this was his greatest rival, Sir Reginald Fostertake's creation. Gott in Himmel, shouted von Sinzig. Luther, you numbskull, you made a hideous mess of things last night. Look, the Golden Hind.